There are a lot of ways to start a neighborhood dispute, but most of them don't end with a Tesla shooting sparks in the middle of the night while the owner screams on her front lawn. And I'll be honest with you, that definitely wasn't the outcome I imagined when I first built my solar system. All I wanted was a quiet house, a little independence, and the satisfaction of knowing I could power my own life without relying on the grid. But sometimes, the moment you build something good, somebody else decides it belongs to them. And in my case, that somebody was a woman named Diane Mercer. Now, before I get into Diane, you have to understand something about me. I'm an electrical engineer by trade. Been doing it close to 20 years now. Industrial systems mostly, power distribution, control panels, the kind of work where one wrong calculation can shut down an entire factory floor. I'm not the loudest guy in the room, never have been. I'm the type who'd rather spend a Saturday afternoon wiring a battery bank than arguing with someone at a barbecue, which is exactly what I did for almost 2 straight years. Weekends, holidays, evenings after work. Piece by piece, I built what I always called my independence project, a fully off-grid solar system. Not one of those little rooftop setups that just lowers your electric bill a bit. I'm talking about a complete standalone system. Solar array on the roof and back shed. 3 battery banks in the garage. Custom inverters, manual transfer panels, everything engineered and installed by me. When I finished it, the system could run my whole house easily, and on a good sunny week it generated more power than I even needed. It wasn't about saving money. Honestly, I probably spent close to 30 grand building it. But there's something deeply satisfying about flipping a switch and knowing every watt flowing through that wire came from sunlight hitting your own roof. No utility company, no outages. Just quiet, reliable power. I even installed an outdoor charging port beside my driveway, so I could plug in my pickup's battery system and any tools I needed. It looked like a normal EV charger, but it was tied directly into my private system. Important detail, because technically, that electricity never touched the public grid. It was mine, and for the first few months, everything worked perfectly. Peaceful neighborhood, friendly neighbors, kids riding bikes down the street. Typical suburban stuff. Then Diane Mercer discovered the charger. Now Diane lived 3 houses down from me. Early 50s maybe, always dressed like she was about to attend a town council meeting. Perfect hair, perfect posture, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was also, unfortunately, the president of our homeowners association. Technically, she was voted in. But from what I heard around the neighborhood, nobody else actually wanted the job. So Diane took it and treated it like she'd just been sworn in as mayor. Suddenly, the neighborhood had standards. Mailbox colors had to match approved tones. Trash bins couldn't be visible from the street. One guy down the block got a warning letter because his American flag pole was slightly misaligned with community aesthetics. I wish I was kidding. Most people just rolled their eyes and ignored her. But when I installed my solar panels, Diane noticed immediately. She showed up in my driveway one afternoon holding a clipboard. Actual clipboard. She stood there looking up at my roof like I'd mounted a satellite dish the size of Texas. Those panels, she said, tapping the board with her pen, weren't approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over. Well, good thing the city approved them, I told her. Permits and everything. She frowned. Our guidelines state that visible exterior installations must maintain neighborhood harmony. I pointed at the paperwork in my garage. City code overrides HOA guidelines. You're welcome to read it. For a second, I thought she might argue. Instead, she just stared at the panels, lips tight. People like Diane hate losing small battles. You can almost see them storing the moment away for later. Sure enough, the tension never really disappeared. Whenever we crossed paths, she'd give me that polite, thin smile. The kind that says, "We're not done here." And for months, nothing happened. Until one night at around 2 in the morning. Now, when you build a system like mine, you install monitoring software. Voltage levels, battery draw, load spikes. Basically, if anything unusual happens, my phone starts screaming like a smoke alarm. So when that alert went off at 2 a.m., it jolted me straight out of sleep. At first, I thought something in the house shorted out. But when I checked the monitor, the system was showing a massive external draw, way higher than normal, which made absolutely no sense. Half asleep, I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. And that's when I saw it. Parked beside my driveway, glowing faintly under the streetlight, was a silver Tesla Model Y, charging from my outlet. And standing beside it arms folded like she owned the place, was Diane Mercer. I just stood there for a second trying to process the scene. "Diane," I finally said, "what exactly are you doing?" She looked over at me like nothing about the situation was strange. "Oh good," she said. "You're up." Then she gestured toward the charger. "You weren't using it overnight, so I figured it wouldn't hurt." I blinked. "You figured what wouldn't hurt?" She smiled, that same tight HOA smile. "Borrowing a little electricity." Now at this point I honestly thought she was joking. I laughed once, but she didn't laugh back. And suddenly I realized she was completely serious. That was the moment I understood something important about Diane Mercer. She genuinely believed the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to her. And standing there in the dark, watching my system quietly pumping power into her car, I had the strangest feeling. This situation wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. It was going to turn into a war. And the crazy part is, that night was only the beginning. Because when I checked my system logs the next morning, I realized Diane hadn't just borrowed electricity once. She'd been doing it for weeks. And that discovery changed everything. The next morning I made coffee, sat down at my workbench in the garage, and opened the system logs. At first I was just curious. I figured maybe Diane had plugged in once before and I hadn't noticed. Maybe twice. But the numbers on the screen told a very different story. Every night for almost 3 weeks there were these identical spikes in power usage, always starting somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, always lasting 3 to 4 hours, always pulling enough energy to charge most of an electric vehicle battery. My system tracks everything, down to the minute. Voltage draw, inverter load, battery discharge, solar recovery the next day. There was no question about what I was looking at. Diane had been walking over in the middle of the night and plugging her car into my private charger like it was a public gas station. I leaned back in the chair and just stared at the screen for a while. The thing that bothered me wasn't even the electricity. I mean, sure, it added up a few dozen dollars each time, maybe more depending on the load. But that wasn't really the point. What bothered me was the entitlement. The assumption that because something existed, she could just take it. Around noon, I printed out the usage reports. Graphs, timestamps, power draw totals. The whole thing looked like something you'd bring into a courtroom. Then I walked 3 houses down and knocked on Diane's door. She answered wearing a blazer like it was a business meeting. "Can I help you?" she said. I held up the papers. "I thought we should talk about last night." Her eyes flicked down to the pages, then back to me. "Oh, that." She didn't even pretend to be embarrassed. "You plugged your car into my charger," I said. "Well, technically," she replied calmly. "Your charger is outside your home." I blinked. "Yes. And since we live in a shared residential community," she continued, "I assumed it was available when not in use." For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond to that. "Diane," I said slowly, "that outlet is connected to my private solar system." She shrugged. "It's renewable energy. That doesn't make it public." She crossed her arms. "You generate excess power anyway. I've seen your panels." I tapped the papers. "You've used roughly 80 kilowatt hours from my system this month." She tilted her head slightly. And that's electricity I paid to produce." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh please," she said. "You didn't pay for sunlight." That line, I'll admit, almost made me lose my patience. But I kept my voice steady. "I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm asking you to stop using it." She stared at me for a second, then gave that same tight HOA smile. "Well, maybe if you didn't want people using it, you shouldn't have installed something that looks like a public charger." Then she closed the door, right in my face. I stood there on her porch for a moment listening to the deadbolt click. And that was when the situation officially crossed from annoying to ridiculous. But it still could have ended there. Honestly, if Diane had just stopped, I probably would have let the whole thing go. Instead, about 5 days later, I opened my mailbox and found an official envelope from the Homeowners Association. Inside was a violation notice. Apparently, I was being formally cited for something called energy exclusivity practices inconsistent with community resource sharing. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it even made sense. According to the letter, my solar system represented externally accessible infrastructure, and denying HOA members access could be interpreted as restricting shared utility benefits. Shared utility benefits. I just stood there at the mailbox laughing like a crazy person. Because only Diane Mercer could invent a rule that claimed my personal solar system belonged to the neighborhood. That evening, I called my friend Marcus. Marcus used to work with me at a plant outside Phoenix before he moved into residential electrical design. If you ever want someone to analyze a bad idea with enthusiasm, Marcus is your guy. I told him the whole story. The charger, the logs, the HOA letter. There was about 5 seconds of silence on the phone. Then Marcus started laughing so hard, I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Oh man," he said finally. "You're telling me the HOA president is stealing your solar power?" "Borrowing," I corrected dryly. "That's incredible. Not helpful." He was still chuckling. "So what are you going to do?" I tried talking to her. "And she thinks sunlight is public property." Marcus whistled. "Well, technically speaking, the sun does belong to everyone." "Marcus, I'm kidding. There was a pause. Then his voice shifted slightly. "You know," he said, "if someone kept plugging into a system like that without permission, you could design a load response circuit." I leaned back in my chair. "A what?" "A protective voltage spike relay." Now, if you're not an electrical person, that probably sounds more dramatic than it is. But the concept is simple. You build a secondary port that looks identical to the real charger. But when something draws current, it triggers a controlled voltage surge that shuts down the connection instantly. Safe for the grid, but extremely unpleasant for whatever device just connected. Marcus continued. "Nothing dangerous," he said. "Just enough to fry a cheap charging cable or scare someone into never touching it again." I stared at the charger outside through the garage window. The wheels in my brain were already turning. "You're saying build a decoy. I'm saying protect your system by electrifying the thief." He laughed again. "Engineers call that a learning experience." For the next 3 evenings, I worked on the design. Not because I wanted revenge. At least that's what I told myself. But because Diane clearly wasn't going to stop. And if someone keeps crossing a line, eventually you stop asking nicely. You reinforce the boundary. By Friday night, the setup was finished. From the outside, it looked identical to my normal charger. Same housing, same cable, same position near the driveway. The real outlet had been rerouted inside the garage. The new one, well, let's just say it had a personality. I also mounted a bright yellow sign right above it. Private power system. Do not use. Clear enough for anyone with functioning eyesight. Which meant, of course, Diane would ignore it. Saturday evening rolled around quietly. The neighborhood was calm. Porch lights glowing. Crickets chirping. Normal suburban life. Around 11:30, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat down at the monitoring console. The camera feed covered the driveway perfectly. Part of me wondered if she'd actually learned her lesson. Maybe the conversation and the HOA letter were enough. Maybe she'd find a public charger somewhere else. Midnight came. Nothing. 12:15. Still quiet. I started to feel a little ridiculous sitting there waiting for something that might never happen. Then at exactly 12:42 a.m., headlights appeared at the end of the street. A silver Tesla rolled slowly toward my house. And I knew immediately. Diane Mercer had decided the rules still didn't apply to her. She parked beside the charger like she'd done it 100 times before. Stepped out wearing pajama pants and a hoodie. Looked around the street once, casually, like someone checking if a parking meter cop was nearby. Then she walked over to the outlet. The yellow warning sign was right there. She glanced at it. Actually paused for a second. I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, she'd finally reconsider. Instead, she shrugged, picked up the charging cable, and plugged it into her Tesla. Back in my garage, the monitoring screen flashed. Load detected. The relay armed. 10 seconds. That's all it took. Then the driveway lit up like someone had fired a camera flash. There was a sharp crack of electricity. A burst of sparks shot out of the charger port. And Diane Mercer jumped backward with a scream that probably woke half the neighborhood. Her Tesla went completely dark. Just dead. I watched the whole thing on the monitor, sitting there with my iced tea, trying very hard not to laugh. Because technically speaking, the system had worked exactly as designed. What I didn't know yet was how Diane was about to react the next morning. And let's just say, she didn't take the lesson quietly. I woke up the next morning to the kind of pounding on my front door that usually means something is either on fire or someone is very, very angry. At first I thought maybe a delivery truck had backed into the house. But then I heard a voice through the door. "Open this door right now." And yep, that was Diane. I pulled on a sweatshirt, walked down the hallway, and opened the door. Standing on my porch was Diane Mercer, looking like she had not slept a single minute. Behind her stood 2 members of the HOA board. One was a quiet older guy named Paul who mostly kept to himself at meetings. The other was a younger woman named Erica who I'd seen walking her dog around the block. Both of them looked confused. Diane, on the other hand, looked like she was ready to start a war. "You tampered with my vehicle," she snapped the second the door opened. I leaned against the doorframe and glanced past her. Her Tesla sat in the driveway across the street, looking sad. The charging port was blackened around the edges, and the cable she'd used was dangling loosely like a burnt piece of spaghetti. I raised an eyebrow. "Morning, Diane." "This isn't funny," she said. Paul cleared his throat awkwardly. "We're just here to understand what happened," he said. Diane spun toward him. "What happened is he sabotaged community infrastructure." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Community infrastructure?" She pointed at my driveway. "That charging station. You mean the one connected to my private electrical system? You left it accessible. You stole electricity." Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. That was when I stepped back inside the house. "Give me 1 second," I said. Diane started yelling something behind me, but I walked calmly into the living room and grabbed a thick binder from the coffee table. I had prepared it the night before, just in case. Inside were printouts from the monitoring system, energy logs, timestamps, camera screenshots, and a neat summary of exactly how much power Diane Mercer had pulled from my solar system over the last 3 weeks. When I stepped back outside, I handed the binder to Paul. He flipped it open slowly. The first page showed a timeline. Night after night. Charging session after charging session. Each one clearly labeled. Paul adjusted his glasses and looked at Diane. "Diane, did you actually plug your car into his system multiple times?" Diane crossed her arms. "That's not the issue." "It kind of is," Erica said quietly. Diane's eyes snapped toward her. "He created a hazardous device." I leaned against the porch railing. "Actually, it's a protective relay designed to prevent unauthorized loads." Paul looked up from the binder. "Did it damage the car?" I shrugged. "From what I saw, it probably fried the charging cable and tripped the car's internal protection systems. Tesla builds those things pretty tough." Diane scoffed. "You're admitting it." "I'm admitting you were repeatedly stealing power from my private system." The word stealing hung in the air for a moment. Paul turned another page in the binder. There were still images from the security cameras. Diane walking up to the charger, plugging in, standing beside the car while it charged. Night after night. Erica leaned over his shoulder. "Oh wow," she muttered. Diane shifted uncomfortably. "That footage was taken without my consent." "It was taken on my property," I said. Paul closed the binder slowly. "Well, this definitely complicates things." Diane stared at him. "Complicates what?" He sighed. "You filed a complaint saying he was restricting access to community utilities." "Yes. But this doesn't appear to be community utilities." She pointed toward my roof. "He generates excess power. And that still doesn't make it public property," Erica said. Diane's face turned red. "This neighborhood has standards." "Yes," Paul replied calmly. "And theft is usually one of them." That line hit harder than I expected. For a moment, nobody spoke. You could hear birds in the trees, someone mowing a lawn 2 houses away. Normal Saturday sounds. Finally, Diane straightened her shoulders. "This isn't over," she said. I shrugged. "You're welcome to call a lawyer." She hesitated. "Because here's the thing. If this situation ever reached a courtroom, those logs would become evidence. Clear evidence." She grabbed the binder out of Paul's hands and shoved it back toward me. "You'll be hearing from the board," she said. Then she turned and marched down the driveway. Paul and Erica lingered a moment. Paul gave me a small nod. "Nice system," he said quietly. "Thanks." Then they followed Diane back toward the street. I stood there on the porch watching them leave. Across the road, Diane was already on her phone, probably calling someone to complain about the injustice of it all. Her Tesla still sat there silently. Not charging, not moving, just parked. The funny part is, the story didn't end that day. A few weeks later, Diane quietly stepped down from her position as HOA president. Officially, she said it was because of personal time commitments. Unofficially, word had spread around the neighborhood about the late-night charging situation. And people had opinions. Lots of opinions. I never installed the decoy charger again after that. Didn't need to. Turns out once someone learns the hard way, they tend to respect boundaries. Most of the time. But every now and then I still sit in the garage looking at the monitoring screen, remembering that night when the sparks flew. And I have to laugh a little. Because in the end, all Diane had to do was ask. Seriously, If she'd knocked on my door and said, "Hey, can I charge my car once in a while?" I probably would have said yes. Instead, she tried to take it. And sometimes the difference between asking and taking is about 10 seconds and one very loud electrical crack. Now I'm curious what you think. Was I justified in protecting my system the way I did? Or did I go too far setting up that little surprise for Diane? Because depending on who you ask, I've heard both sides of that argument. So drop your opinion in the comments. Would you have handled it differently? Or would you have done exactly the same thing? And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare neighbor like this, I definitely want to hear that story too. They tried to make me pay 6 figures to upgrade a bridge I built with my own 2 hands. Said it was a safety issue. Said it was my responsibility. What they really meant was their new luxury resort needed a shortcut, and my land just happened to be in the way. I didn't argue at first. I listened, and then I tore the bridge down. Now, before you decide I'm some bitter old guy shaking a fist at progress, let me back up a little. My name's Daniel Harper. I'm 58, widowed, semi-retired if you want to call it that. I own about 40 acres along a bend in the Coldwater River in western North Carolina. Not mountain postcard pretty, not tourist town flashy, just quiet hardwood forest, a little pasture, and a stretch of river that curves like it's in no hurry to get anywhere. That's what I loved about it the first time I saw it 20 years ago. It didn't try to impress anyone. When I bought the land, there was no real access across the river. Just an old logging trail that washed out every heavy rain. The main county road ran on the opposite bank, and if I wanted to reach the back fields or haul equipment across, I had to detour miles upstream to a narrow gravel crossing that wasn't even mine. So I did what any stubborn man with a welder and more pride than sense would do. I built a bridge. Not a grand thing. No stone arches, no steel trusses. Just a timber span about 40 feet long, pressure-treated beams, reinforced joists, thick oak planks on top. I hired an engineer to draw it up, filed the permits, waded through inspections, anchored both ends well inside my surveyed boundary. I still have the county stamp on the original blueprint rolled up in a tube in my workshop. It was designed for light trucks, tractors, the occasional delivery van. Nothing commercial, nothing heavy. It didn't need to be. It served one purpose, giving me access to my own land. For years, that bridge was just part of my routine. Cross in the morning with a cup of coffee in the console, check the fence line, maybe fish at dusk on the far bank. Sometimes I'd sit halfway across and listen to the river sliding under the boards. It creaked in the summer heat, popped in the winter cold, but it was solid. For a long time, it was just mine. Then the land upstream sold. I remember the day I noticed the survey flags. Bright orange tape fluttering through the trees like someone had tagged the forest for surgery. I asked around town and found out a development group out of Charlotte had bought nearly 200 acres along the river. Their name was Blue Fern Hospitality. Fancy logo, lots of talk about eco-luxury and curated experiences. Within months, the quiet upstream turned into a construction site. Earth movers, dump trucks, the wine of saws. They cleared just enough trees to make it look intentional, built cabins with floor-to-ceiling windows, strung cafe lights along walking paths. Then came the restaurant deck overlooking the water. Kayak racks, fire pits. Their website called it a secluded riverside escape. I won't lie, part of me was curious. I drove up to the county meeting when they presented the plans. The lead developer, a guy named Evan Calloway, tall, pressed shirt, perfect teeth, stood there talking about boosting the local economy, bringing jobs, putting Coldwater on the map. Folks in town clapped. I didn't. Not because I hated the idea, but because I've seen what happens when something calls itself secluded while selling $200 a night cabins. Still, I kept to myself. Their land was upstream. Mine was downstream. The river between us didn't care. The first time one of their trucks crossed my bridge, I thought it was a mistake. A white pickup with their logo on the side rolled across mid-morning while I was stacking firewood. I stepped out and waved it down. Driver rolled his window halfway. Sorry, man. GPS brought me this way. This is private, I said, pointing to the small wooden sign I'd had posted for years. Private bridge. No public access. He nodded, embarrassed. Didn't know? Won't happen again. I believed him. Then it happened again. And again. At first it was contractors. Then delivery vans with restaurant supplies. One afternoon, I watched a flatbed hauling stone for their landscaping creep across, the planks groaning under the weight in a way I'd never heard before. That sound stuck with me. Wood has a language. You learn it if you work with it long enough. That was the sound of something being asked to do more than it was built for. I replaced the old sign with bigger ones. Bright white lettering. Private property. No through traffic. I even added a chain across one end for a while, but I hated the look of it. Felt like I was barricading myself from a world I didn't invite. Then the guests started showing up. I'd be sitting on my porch and see SUVs full of weekenders roll up, slow down, hesitate at the sign, then drive across anyway. Some waved cheerfully like we were neighbors. One woman actually stopped and asked if this was the scenic entrance to Blue Fern. Scenic entrance. I almost laughed. It wasn't just inconvenience. It was where. My bridge was never meant to handle steady commercial traffic. And legally, that mattered. So I drove up to the resort one afternoon and asked to speak to someone in charge. That's how I met Evan Calloway in person. He greeted me on the deck overlooking the river, all charm and handshakes. Daniel, right? We've heard about you. Beautiful property you've got. We need to talk about the bridge, I said. He tilted his head slightly, like he'd expected this. We're aware some guests may have used that route. Our marketing team is updating directions. Some guests, I repeated. Your contractors too. That structure wasn't designed for commercial use. He smiled, the kind of smile that tries to stay friendly while measuring you. Well, interesting thing about that bridge, Daniel. Our survey indicates it connects to what used to be a shared access road decades ago. There may be historical usage rights involved. I felt something tighten in my chest. There are no easements on my deed. Perhaps, he said smoothly. But if it functions as access to multiple properties, safety standards come into play. There it was. Not a request. A setup. I drove home with that conversation looping in my head, the river flashing silver through the trees. That night, I pulled out my deed, my surveys, every document I had. I spread them across the kitchen table like I was preparing for trial. And a week later, the letter arrived. The envelope had their logo in the corner. Blue Fern Hospitality. Thick paper, attorney's name at the bottom. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a strategy. I stood at my kitchen counter, reading it twice before I even sat down. According to their legal team, my bridge connected to a historically utilized access corridor serving adjacent parcels. Because of that, they claimed it needed to comply with commercial safety standards if it was to remain in use. Their engineer had assessed it, apparently without stepping foot on my property, and recommended widening the span, reinforcing the substructure, increasing load capacity, installing guardrails to code, adding lighting, and posting commercial weight ratings. Estimated cost, $118,000. The final paragraph was the cleanest cut of all. Given the bridge's functional integration into regional access patterns, I, as the property owner, was responsible for ensuring it met current standards. Failure to do so could expose me to significant liability should an incident occur. They didn't ask me to upgrade it. They told me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. I'm not a lawyer. I don't throw around words like functional integration in everyday conversation. But I do understand plain English. What they were saying was simple. Your bridge is useful to us. Therefore, you need to make it better for us. On your dime. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared of them, but because I was thinking about responsibility. If one of their guests drove across my bridge, overloaded it, and something failed, even if they were trespassing, I'd still be the one standing in court explaining why I didn't do more to prevent it. That's how it works. You can be right and still lose money defending yourself. The next morning I called my neighbor, Walt Grayson. Walt's 72, retired county surveyor, the kind of man who still irons his flannel shirts. He's forgotten more about land boundaries than most attorneys ever learn. I laid everything out on his dining room table. He adjusted his glasses, read through the letter slowly, then pulled one of my old surveys closer. There's no recorded easement here, he said, tapping the page. If there was a shared access route, it would be documented. Dirt tracks don't count. They're implying historical use, I said. Walt snorted. Historical use is what folks say when they can't find paperwork. We drove out to the bridge together. He walked the boundary lines with a small handheld GPS unit, nodding to himself. Both abutments were well within my property lines, just like I remembered. The old so-called shared road they referenced was nothing more than a faint depression in the woods, probably from logging equipment back in the 80s. Legally, It's yours, Walt said. But that doesn't mean they won't try to make it complicated. That word stuck with me. Complicated. That's how pressure works. You don't break someone in one swing. You bury them in paperwork, inspections, complaints. 2 weeks later, the county inspector showed up. Nice enough guy. Apologetic even. Said they'd received an anonymous complaint that my bridge posed a public safety hazard due to increased traffic volume. He walked it, measured a few boards, checked the guardrails. It's fine for private use, he said quietly. But if it's being used commercially. I didn't invite commercial use, I replied. He gave me a look that said he understood, but understanding and enforcement aren't the same thing. After he left, I drove straight to Blue Fern. This time, Evan didn't greet me on the deck. He met me in his office, glass walls, framed photos of smiling couples by the river. You filed a complaint, I said without sitting down. He leaned back in his chair. Daniel, we're concerned about guest safety. If navigation apps are routing people over your bridge, that's a shared problem. It becomes my problem when you start talking liability. He folded his hands. We're willing to collaborate. Shared funding. Perhaps we split the upgrade cost. It benefits both properties. I don't need a commercial-grade bridge, I said. You do. He didn't deny it. He just smiled that measured smile again. Your land value increases with improved infrastructure. There it was. The pitch. Progress. Growth. Community benefit. What he didn't say was that their entire marketing strategy depended on being easily accessible. Their brochures boasted about the short scenic drive from the highway. The most scenic part of that drive was my bridge. I went home and stood halfway across it at sunset. The river was high from recent rain, sliding under the beams with a steady hush. I ran my hand along the top rail, felt the small splinters where years of weather had roughened the wood. I built this, I thought, for a simple reason, to reach my own land. And now it was being reframed as infrastructure. The pressure didn't stop. Delivery trucks kept coming. Guests kept following their phones. I started keeping a notebook by the door, writing down license plates, dates, times. Not because I wanted to be that guy, but because I felt like I needed a record. If this went to court, I wanted to show I hadn't consented to any of it. One Saturday afternoon, a large catering truck tried to cross. I was outside when I heard the engine rev low, the board straining. I stepped into the middle of the bridge and held up my hand. The driver rolled down his window. We're late for a wedding reception, he said. Not across here you're not, I replied. He looked past me at the river, at the narrow span. GPS says this is the fastest route. GPS doesn't own this bridge, I said. He reversed slowly, muttering under his breath. That evening, I got a call from Evan. I hear you blocked one of our vendors. I protected my property. You're escalating this, he said, voice tighter than before. No, I answered. You escalated it when you tried to hand me a 6-figure bill. There was a pause on the line. I could hear music in the background, laughter, glasses clinking. A wedding in full swing. Daniel, he said finally, we can pursue formal recognition of access if necessary. It would be unfortunate. That was the first time he said it plainly. They were considering legal action to establish some kind of prescriptive easement, arguing that repeated use created a right. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. Here's the part people don't see in stories like this. It's not about revenge. It's about erosion. Little by little, something that was yours alone starts being treated like it belongs to everyone. And if you don't push back, eventually the paperwork catches up to the assumption. I called a property attorney in Asheville the following week. Laid everything out. He listened carefully, then said something simple. You're on solid ground. But if traffic continues and they argue long-term public use, things get messy. Judges don't like ambiguity. What's the cleanest solution? I asked. He didn't hesitate. Remove the structure. I laughed at first. You're kidding. I'm not. No bridge, no access argument. No access, no upgrade requirement. You eliminate liability entirely. I drove home thinking about that. The simplest solution wasn't to fight them in court. It wasn't to upgrade. It wasn't to negotiate. It was to make the problem disappear. For a week, I walked that bridge every evening. I listened to it creak, watched the sunset from its midpoint, remembered hauling lumber across it when I first built the cabin. It felt almost disloyal to consider tearing it down, but it also felt like the only move left that was entirely mine. I went down to the county office on a Tuesday morning and applied for a demolition permit. The clerk looked surprised. You're removing it voluntarily? Yes, ma'am. Most folks try to expand, not reduce. I smiled. I'm simplifying. Approval came faster than I expected. Maybe because there were no environmental concerns. Maybe because paperwork is easier when you're taking something away instead of adding it. I hired a small local crew, not the big contractors Blue Fern used. Just 3 guys I'd known for years. When I told Walt what I planned, he stared at me for a long moment. You sure? He asked. They want a commercial bridge, I said. They can build one on their own land. The morning we started, a thin fog hung over the river. I stood at the edge of the span while the crew unloaded tools. Across the water, I could see the roof lines of the resort cabins through the trees. For the first time since this started, I felt calm. The first board came up with a sound I'll never forget, a long, slow groan followed by the sharp squeal of nails giving way, like the bridge itself was clearing its throat one last time. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets while the guys worked, telling myself I was fine, that this was just lumber and bolts and hardware. But it didn't feel that simple. This bridge had carried groceries, lumber, fishing rods, memories. It had carried my wife, back when she was still here, sitting in the passenger seat teasing me about how I overbuilt everything. It had carried quiet mornings and long evenings. And now I was the one taking it apart. By mid-morning, half the planks were stacked neatly on the bank. The beams underneath were exposed, thick treated timbers I'd bolted into concrete footings 2 decades earlier. I knelt down and ran my hand along one of them, remembering the day we set it in place. I was younger then, stronger, certain that if I built something solid enough, it would stay that way. Around noon, a black SUV rolled up on the opposite side. Evan stepped out. He didn't wave this time. He stood there watching for a few minutes before walking across the remaining span toward me. The crew paused instinctively, tools resting against their hips. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Removing a liability," I said. "You can't be serious." "I am." He looked at the missing planks, the widening gap where river light showed through. "Daniel, this is unnecessary. We were prepared to revisit cost sharing. I don't want a commercial bridge," I replied evenly. "And I don't want your guests on my land. This affects more than just you," he said, voice sharpening. "Our delivery routes, emergency access, guest experience. Those are your logistics," I said. "Not mine." He stepped closer. "You're hurting a local business." I almost smiled at that. "You tried to hand me a bill for $118,000. That's not community partnership." For a second, the polished charm slipped. "We're talking about regional growth. Property values rise with infrastructure improvements." "Then build infrastructure," I said quietly. "On your side." The crew resumed work. Bolts loosened. Metal clinked against wood. Evan stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back the way he came, shoes clicking on boards that would be gone by sundown. By late afternoon, the center span was dismantled in sections. We used a small crane to lift the heavier beams and set them onto a flatbed trailer. When the final cross member came free, the 2 halves of the bridge stood separated by 20 feet of open air. The river flowed through uninterrupted, silver and indifferent. Standing there, looking at the empty space, I expected to feel regret. Instead, I felt something lighter. Not triumph, not anger, just relief. The next morning was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in months. No engines idling at the entrance. No tires crunching across wood. No GPS-confused voices echoing from open windows. The only sound was water and wind through sycamores. I drove into town for feed and past the turnoff that used to lead across my bridge. Someone had already updated the navigation systems. Cars headed east now, toward the longer paved county road that Blue Fern had originally ignored because it added nearly 4 miles. For miles. That's what this whole battle had been about. A few days later, Evan called again. "This isn't over," he said. "It is for me. We're reviewing options." "Do what you need to do," I answered. "So will I." But the truth was, there wasn't much they could review. Without a structure, there was no functional access to argue over. No ongoing use to claim prescriptive rights. Just a river dividing 2 properties the way nature intended. They did request a formal meeting with a mediator a week later. I went, mostly out of curiosity. It was held in a neutral office in town, beige walls, stale coffee. Evan came with his attorney. I came alone. Their proposal was straightforward. They would fund the majority of a new bridge if I granted a permanent recorded easement allowing commercial traffic across my land. that ensures long-term stability for both parties, the attorney said smoothly. Long-term for who? I asked. For the community, Evan replied. I leaned back in my chair. I bought my land because it wasn't part of anyone's long-term development plan. I'm not interested in becoming your access corridor. The mediator asked if there was any compromise I'd consider. I thought about it for a moment. About money. About convenience. About how easy it would be to say yes and let someone else rebuild bigger, stronger, shinier. Then I pictured weekend traffic streaming past my porch for the next 20 years. No, I said simply. The meeting ended there. Over the next month, I restored the riverbank where the bridge had stood. We removed the old concrete footings down to grade, filled the gaps with gravel and soil. I spread native grass seed along the approach road and let it take root. At the entrance, I installed a steel gate, not because I needed one anymore, but because I wanted the boundary to be visible. Upstream, Blue Fern kept operating. They adjusted, built better signage directing guests to the proper route, expanded the eastern entrance. From what I hear, business didn't collapse. Weddings still happen. Kayaks still line the shore. Sometimes I sit on my porch in the evening and look upstream, the cabins just visible through trees. I don't hate them. I don't even hate Evan. He did what developers do. He saw an opportunity and tried to optimize it. I did what landowners sometimes forget they're allowed to do. I said no. Here's the part that sticks with me. Progress isn't always someone else's responsibility. And convenience isn't a right just because technology points you somewhere faster. That bridge was mine. Not in a symbolic way. Not in a handshake agreement kind of way. Legally. Physically. Morally. They tried to reframe it as shared infrastructure. I reframed it as optional. People around town still debate whether I overreacted. Some say I should have taken the shared funding and enjoyed a sturdier crossing. Others think I protected something more valuable than wood and nails. So I'll ask you, if you were in my place, would you have upgraded the bridge and split the cost? Would you have granted the easement and embraced the growth? Or would you have done what I did, removed the leverage entirely and let the river run free? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand, because stories like this don't have clean heroes and villains. They have interests, pressure, pride, and choices. And sometimes the strongest move isn't building something bigger. It's deciding you don't need it at all.